Like Ramsey, I'm not going to talk about the star very much, which is the story, my world that featured in morphologies, because, as you said, it's kind of all in there. It's a very interesting story, and I analyse it in there in terms of its legacy, in particular inspiring When Worlds Collide, that movie. If you know that movie, that's what the story is like. Wells wasn't credited, but there's a whole argument there about who nicked what from whom. No, what I want to talk instead about is this book, The War of the Worlds by Wells, closely related to the Star, as I will describe. I'm working on a sequel to this at the moment, which should be out next year. So I've really been digging into The War of the Worlds and the Star and related fictions. And I do think one good excuse for writing sequels is that you get a creative writer looking hard at a book like this, which I have a different perspective on how the literary theorists would look at it. You know, they begin from the finished text, and maybe the writer's got a bit more of a chance of seeing, or guessing at least, what processes Wells went through in creating the thing. So I've got a theory that I'm going to propound tonight about how Wells developed the War of the Worlds as it's become, particularly using manipulating a technique, his techniques of narrative mode, as I will describe. Yes, so to talk about, where do I begin? Yes, what do I mean by narrative mode? I was going to ask Ramsey to describe that.
No,
maybe not that.
You're
Yes, well, look at it. Well, I looked at Wikipedia just to make sure I knew what I was talking about. And as usual, it's pretty good as long as you check and everything. Narrative mode, it's the use of, or the particularly chosen methodology or process of, a written or spoken commentary to convey a story to an audience. It's the way you tell the story, right? And there are various points of view. You can use first person point of view. I did this, I did that. Third person, he did this, she did that, and so forth. Alternating person, where you have a number of viewpoint characters. So first person point of view is useful, say, in crime fiction, detective fiction, maybe when you want to follow the footsteps of the detective. Disaster story, multiple third persons, you know, when you're seeing this global calamity from a number of points of view, which may or may not be related. There's also endless variations on these things, but there's also the omniscient point of view, which you can try out, where you have a narrator who knows far more than any character in the novel could possibly know. Very fashionable, popular in the 19th century, but not so much now, although it does still hang around. And here's a little example. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, Luke Skywalker has vanished. In his absence, the sinister first one, blah, blah, that's from the latest Star Wars film. So you see here the narrator, who's ever telling you this in this crawl, as they call it, which was nicked, wasn't it, from 1930s movies, Flash Gordon and so on, as a technique in cinema. Whoever's telling you this is not in this. Han Solo can't know about us, far in his future and on the other side of the universe, looking back at him. Han Solo, tragic, I just shed a tear in the movie. But still, you know, this is a valid point of view to use, the omniscient point of view. And Wells used a point of view rather like that, and I'm going to describe how he used this point of view, or manipulates it, to great effect in The War of the Worlds. But I'll start with The Star, the story, published in 1897. Have they all got copies? Right, actually, all read. The Star itself is, well, let's talk about its relation to War of the Worlds. I think what we've got with The Star, which is a story about a rogue star swimming into the solar system. It's a bit like throwing a hand grenade onto a billiard table, I think, you know, because it destroys Neptune, sails in towards the Earth, carams off the moon, and messes around with the solar system, leaves the Earth in a terrible state, but we do survive. So it's kind of an impersonal disaster story. I think what Wells was doing at that time, he had this notion in his head, this is my theory now, of some kind of cosmic disaster story. We know he read Jules Verne, who wrote Off on the Comet, about a comet hitting the Earth. A French astronomer, a writer called Flammarion, again, comets hitting or approaching the Earth. So that material was all there. However, he had a crucial conversation with his brother Frank one day. They were talking about colonialism and how the Tasmanians in particular had been wiped out in 50 years by Western colonists. It's actually wiped out. A late imperial scandal, really, which pricked the conscience of many people. So Brother Frank said, how would we feel if a bunch of guys fell down from the sky and treated us the way we've treated the Tasmanians? And I think Wells put that together with the cosmic disaster story, you see. So instead of a star swimming in, it's a Martian invasion fleet. He dedicated the book to Frank in the end, his brother, which shows he must have got on better than I did with my brother. But anyway, I'll tell the story. But still, writers don't throw away ideas. So what Wells seems to have done is, to me anyway, is summarise the novel that might have been in this story, The Stars. So this is kind of the War of the Worlds that it might have been without the Martians. And so what voice does he use? I'll just read the first paragraph, as you've got it there. It was on the first day of the new year that the announcement was made, almost simultaneously from 3 observatories, the motion of the planet Neptune, the outermost of all the planets that wheel about the sun, become very erratic. Ogilvy had already called attention to a suspected retardation in its velocity in December. Such a piece of news was scarcely calculated to interest the world, the greater portion of whose inhabitants were unaware of the existence of planet Neptune, nor outside the astronomical profession did the subsequent discovery of a faint remote speck of light in the region of the perturbed planet cause any great excitement. Scientific people, however, found the intelligence remarkable enough, even before it became known that the new body was rapidly growing larger and brighter, that its motion was quite different from the orderly progress of the planets, and the deflection of Neptune and its satellite was becoming now of an unprecedented kind. So, setting up the story. So it's basically an omniscient narrator. However, I've got a different printout from you, but if you flick forward to about halfway through, you'll find pronoun I. You must not imagine, because I have spoken of people praying through the night, and people going aboard ships and people fleeing, that the whole world was in terror. Don't go looking for it now, but it's there. So this isn't quite an omniscient narrator. It's more like a journalist who's researched the thing and is describing the story back to you, or maybe a historian with a kind of elevated point of view. Okay? And this is a technique that, or a point of view that Wells used repeatedly in his short stories in this period. The 1890s, great time to be a short story writer, if we're going to talk about short stories, or a fluent columnist as Wells was. His first novel published in 1895. And he found he was a very easy writer, very fluent. He wrote these terrific short stories, terrific scientific columns for a huge forest of journals, newspapers, daily, weekly, and monthly, of a massive market, and just ate up everything he could sell. And he became, his techniques very quickly, it seems to be, became quite mature. And the narrative technique that he used was this kind of omniscient observer almost, but embedded in the story, and he used it to, among other things, to establish a certain credibility. You see, if you've got a skeptical observer within your story, as you're describing men from Mars or aliens at the bottom of the sea, then the skeptic, by being skeptical, but then saying, I don't really believe this, except for one detail, that one detail, whatever it is, convinces you that the thing is true. And a good example of this in slightly longer form is from The Time Machine. So I should have mentioned actually that Andy contributed to that edition of The War of the Worlds I was waving around. It's the Penguin Classics edition from 2005 with edited by Patrick Carringer, a great Wellsian scholar, introduced by Brian August, and Andy did an essay on the locations in The War of the World. The geography of the invasions, they run around Surrey and so forth. All carefully researched by Wells. Once again, he's trying to convince you that the fantastic can happen. And he does it by checking the distance between Woking and Leatherhead, Because he's got that right, you believe the Martians. It's all a kind of trick and illusion. If I had 6 words to tell to a novice writer, 3 of them would be research, as Wells did. Remind me to say the other 3 later if I remember. Okay. Yes, so The Time Machine. The skeptical observer. Now, I'm sure you know the basic story of the time machine. This guy invents a time machine in his cellar around about the turn of the 20th century. He goes off to the future, sees the Morlocks and Eli, comes back again with his story. The frame of the story is as you see it certainly in the 1960 movie. It's dinner parties. He has a dinner party with more or less sceptical friends, one of whom is the narrator of the book itself. And the time traveller, as he tells the story, it's all in quotes. You know, this is what he's saying to this observer. And so what proof has he got? He goes off from a dinner party one week, he comes back the next week, he's beaten up, I think he's lost a couple of shoes, you know, he looks a bit muddy. I've had a terrible time. He goes on this fantastic tale of the far future. Well, it's not all that convincing, is it? You know, where's the evidence? He didn't take a camera, for one thing. However, he's going through his story, and here we are, halfway through the book, roughly, or one halfway through, and he talks about Weena. He says, my pockets had always puzzled Weena, this girl from the future. But at the last, she concluded they were an eccentric kind of vase for floral decoration. At least she utilised them for that purpose. Oh, and that reminds me, in changing my jacket, I found. The time traveller paused, put his hand into his pocket and silently placed 2 withered flowers, not unlike very large white mallows, on the little table. Then he resumed his narrative. As the host of the evening crept over the world and we proceeded over the hill, Weena grew tired and so on, he carries on with his story. A little later, he comes back to the flowers. He's finished the story. His friends are a bit sceptical. What a shame you're not a writer of stories, one of them says. And he goes, the time traveller says, well, to tell you the truth, I hardly believe it myself, and yet his eye fell with a mute inquiry upon the withered white flowers on the table. The medical man rose, came to the lamp, and examined the flowers. The gynaeceum was odd, he said. The psychologist leant forward to see, holding out his hand for a specimen. It's a course to on, said the journalist. How shall we get home? Oh, there's cabs at the station, said the psychologist. It's a curious thing, said the medical man, but I don't know the natural order of these flowers. Can I have them? Time traveller hesitated, and suddenly, certainly not. But where did you really get them, said the medical man. The time traveller put his hand to his head. He spoke like one who was trying to keep hold of an idea that eluded him. They were put into my pocket by Weena when I travelled into time. I'm damned if it isn't all going. This room and you and the atmosphere, it's too much for my memory. So even he's sceptical of his own story, but that detail of these strange flowers is what convinces you that it's real. So a sceptical observer embedded within the story. Right, now we turn to the War of the Worlds. So what I'm arguing is that as he drafted this book, as I'll describe, he found ways to manipulate the observer, the narrative mode, to improve the story and deepen it, make it what it is today. So again, I'll read a little bit from the beginning of this book, the first chapter, the first paragraph, and then I'll go right to the end. So the first paragraph, the eve of the war, first paragraph of the first chapter. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's and yet as mortal as his own. As men busied themselves about the various concerned, they were scrutinised and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinise the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. And early in the 20th century came the great disillusionment. Well, that's a great paragraph, famous. Richard Burton did it better than even I could in the Jeff Wayne thing. And what's he doing? He's doing many things. For one thing, he's setting up the ending of the book. Spoiler alert, you know, bacteria kill the Martians in the end. Which seems a bit like a Deus ex machina. It comes from outside and destroys them, but in fact, he carefully sees this idea all the way through the book, that the bacteria are inimical to the Martians. And it's in the very first paragraph, he's mentioning bugs under the microscope. It's there, the idea is seeded in your head straight away, very skillfully. And the use of language as well, you know, is kind of Churchillian. Churchill would use simple language, but with a grave beat in it, slowly and surely, and fast and cruel and unsympathetic. So that's extremely effective. But this sounds like, doesn't it, an omniscient narrator, how does he know about the minds on Mars? How does he know about what was going on across the planet? Well, the narrator here there's an I here after about 3 pages in this case. He's a journalist. He's like a super Wells in a way. He's a Wells who's about the same age probably, about 30, but he's more successful. He lives in the same town as Wells was living at the time, but up the hill and lived in a better house. So he's a kind of a uber Wells, but he's the same kind of character. He's a journalist, he's observing, he's writing notes, and he's your objective and sceptical viewpoint character, like in the short stories. However, fast forward to the end, here's paragraphs right from the end, the same guy, right, the same I who's told the story throughout. I go to London and I see the busy multitudes in Fleet Street and the Strand, and it comes to my mind that they are but ghosts of the past, haunting the streets that I've seen silent and wretched, phantasms in a dead body. Strange is it to stand on Primrose Hill, to see the great provinces of houses dim and blue, to see the people walking to and fro among the flower beds, to see the sightseers above the Martian machine that stands there still, and to recall the time when I saw it all bright and clear, cut hard and silent, when it was the dawn of the last great day, when he found the Martians dead. Strangest of all is it to hold my wife's hand again, and to think that I've counted her, and she has counted me among the dead. So no omniscient narrator now is dived right down into introspection, he's looking at his own emotions and his own reactions. So there's quite a journey that you're taken on with the narrator through the book. What's going on? Well, we have quite a few surviving drafts of The War of the Worlds as it happens. I think it's Illinois, isn't it, where they've got the most Wellesian manuscripts. But you can read about them in the critical editions and reproductions and comments on these drafts. And also the magazine serialisation of War of the Worlds in 1997 emerged as Wells was writing the book, and that serves as a kind of middle draft as well. In fact, he used the proofs of the magazine version to mark up for his final novel version. And through this, you can see how the novel and the narrator in particular evolved. And I think to sum all that up, probably oversimplifying maybe, but I would say there's two versions of the story, really. A kind of beginning, first draft, which Wells' first intention, and then his final draft. They start in the same place, with it's Woking, the cylinder comes down, the observer, the narrator sees it out of his window, he goes to see the pit and so forth. When it becomes clear, when the Martians start acting, they're not peace envoys, but they're more like French lorry drivers with a grudge. So he gets out of there with his wife. The wife's a bit passive, but he clearly is devoted to his wife. Loads her onto a cart he nicked from a nearby pub. They both drive over to Leatherhead, which is sort of east of Woking, 10 miles, 11 miles, something like that. Leaves her there, and then comes back, partly to give the cart back, but also he wants to be back near the action again. You know, he's an observer in that way. A bit more mischief making by the Martians. Now, in this first draft, what happens then is the observer, the narrator escapes, and he goes back to Leatherhead looking for his wife, which is the logical thing to do. He talks about his wife a lot. He goes back to Leatherhead to find her. He finds Leatherhead's been destroyed. The house where his wife was staying, destroyed. His wife seems to be dead. And he's mortified, horrified, and he's enraged. But he does a fairly rational thing. He pursues the Martians. He comes across a character called Marriott, who is a kind of, as the Martians have destroyed civilization in the south of England for the time being at least, he's emerged as a kind of local guerrilla fighter or resistance leader, this character Marriott. And he provides the narrator with explosives. So the narrator decides to become a suicide bomber. You know, you've killed my wife, I'm going to kill you. And he pursues the Martians into central London, meaning to destroy at least one, take one with me, only to find that the bugs have done their work and the Martians are dead. So that's the original version of the story, and it shows this reaction of the guy to the horror of the war. He's horrified and he becomes suicidal. It's a suicidal rage. He's going to destroy something. So, in a way, a fairly conventional story. However, the final version, which you read in the finished book, is rather different. Begins the same way. Martians arrive in Woking, gets the wife off to Leatherhead, leaves her there, goes back to Woking. But then everything gets smashed up. He gets confused. He keeps saying he wants to go back to Leatherhead to pick up his wife. But by now he's fallen in with an artilleryman, detached from his unit. He says, well, the Martians are in the way, come with me we'll get around them somehow. And he goes, rather than going east or south to his wife, he heads north after the Martians. He goes through Weybridge, which he's destroyed, to north of Woking. He gets trapped in a house for days with the curate, if you recall that character, a nut job religious guy, really. He's starving, he has to kill the curate to keep him from betraying them. He falls in with the artilleryman again, who by now has become a kind of deranged version of Marriott, the resistance leader. He's got these schemes which are actually quite rational about how we would survive at the Feast of the Marshals. We'd be like big rats in the sewer, striking back when we can, learning when we can, eventually rising up. Rational schemes, but the artilleryman himself is a fool in action. He sits there drinking champagne and playing cards instead of actually doing anything. And eventually our narrator goes off, he wanders in a daze really into London, only to find the Martians dead and slain once again. So he's become, you can see just from that sketch, he's become much more vague. He keeps on saying he wants to get to Leatherhead, but he goes in the opposite direction. With no particular intention in mind, he just follows the destruction. And a few little quotes here to describe his state of mind. Just after he sees the first devastating destruction inflicted by the Martians, he says, he runs and then falls over and lays still. And then I sat up strangely perplexed. For a moment I couldn't understand how I got there. My terror had fallen from me like a garment, he says. Perhaps I'm a man of exceptional moods. I don't know how far my experience is common. At times I suffer from the strangest sense of detachment from the world about me. I seem to watch it all from outside, from out of time and out of space. He's already an oddball, you see, before the Martians even arrive. Maybe need that to be a kind of utopian writer as he was. But certainly he has these massive mood swings as he goes through the trauma of the Martian attack. A little further on, I talked about how he's got this conflicting goal. He wants to try and get to his wife. On the other hand, he's drawn somehow to the Martians. He says, it's a curious thing that I felt angry with my wife. I can't account for it, but my impotent desire to reach Leatherhead worried me excessively. So he's conflicted, not even just what he does, but on the inside as well. And finally, what he calls the strangest thing in this story, he gets to the Martians at the end of the campaign. The Martians are dead. Now comes the strangest thing in my story. Perhaps it's not altogether strange. I remember clearly and coldly and vividly all I did on that time, praising God upon the summit of Primrose Hill, and then I forgot. Over the next 3 days I know nothing. I've learned since about what the Martians did, but of all this I have no memory. I drifted, a demented man. I found myself in a house of kindly people who had found me on the third day, wandering, weeping and raving through the streets. They told me I was singing some inane doggerel about being the last man left alive, hurrah. These people looked after me, and so on. Very gently, when my mind was assured again, did they break to me, and so on. So he goes through this period of total psychological shutdown. What is Wells groping for here? If you look at descriptions of shell shock, now that's a term that wasn't coined until the Second World War, the First World War, and not described properly by the medics until then, papers in Lancet and so on. But it had been recognised in the American Civil War and conflicts like that, the Franco-Prussian War. The symptoms you get are tics, mutism, paralysis, nightmares, tremors, fugue, which is this kind of dropout, and hallucination. So, I think what Wells was groping for imaginatively was a much deeper reaction, more visceral psychological reaction to the horror of the Martian War on the part of his narrator. He was groping. He predicted, in his book, he predicted space flight of a kind, he predicted mechanized warfare, he predicted bacteriological warfare, but I think he was also predicting shell shock, this horror of being under the thumb of mechanized war. And he, through his drafts, he manipulated the narrator to get to this point. And you can see the difference between the original version, the Marriott version, where he's a suicide bomber, how much deeper it is. The reaction of the narrator is much deeper, much better thought out in this later draft. And it makes the Martian seem bigger. The guy's pushed down further, so it makes the Martian seem that much bigger, and the drama of the story still more impressive. So that's my thesis, that Wells started with the kind of almost omniscient narrator, journalistic voice of his short stories, but he finishes up with a much more complex character at the end of the day. And what were you going to remind me of, Anthony?
The other thing.
Three of the R's, yes. The first was research, and the final three is revise. And if you see from Wells's drafts, he had handwritten manuscripts scribbled over, typed manuscripts scribbled over, revise. It was good enough for him, it'd be good enough for me. Thank you.